Hi, Jacques. How are you?
Hi, I am good. How are you?
I'm doing well, and it's very nice to meet you. And thank you for taking the time today to chat with me about what you do. You're very well known in the legal community, especially in criminal law, as you've been covering many of the cases that are happening in the criminal courtrooms. So I wanted today to talk to you so you can tell us a bit more about what you do. And let's start by you introducing yourself, Jacques.
Sure. So thanks for having me. I'm the Courts and Justice reporter at the Toronto Star, and I've been doing that now for um just over almost a year and a half. And then I also covered legal affairs for several years before the pandemic. And I did some other things during the pandemic. I mostly reported on federal politics during the pandemic, but I've been back covering courts and justice since the end of 2022. So that involves covering trials, covering mostly criminal matters, both in Superior Court and in the OCJ, and as well some cases at the Court of Appeal. And it also involves reporting on more systemic issues as well. So not necessarily any particular case, but more systemic issues facing the justice system as well. Anything from legal aid funding to judicial vacancies to delay to properly resourcing the courts, all of that. And some law
Uh,
society stuff too, actually.
yeah.
The occasional law society discipline here as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we will be talking about some of these specific issues that you mentioned.
Mhm.
But before we get into that, just in general and as, like out of curiosity, so when you do cover a case or an issue, how does that happen? Is it someone who contacts you, or is it something that you're interested in, that you've heard about, or you're aware of, and that you decide that you want to cover? So how does that process happen that gets you involved in a case?
So it's like a big mix. Certainly there are certain cases that are very high profile from the very beginning, from the moment a person has been arrested. And I'm thinking especially of, we had several cases of homicides and other kind of violent attacks on the TTC in the last year, and that
Right.
always captures people's attention. So we sort of track the progress of those cases through the system right from the beginning. But certainly when I'm about to now cover a case, whether it's the beginning or maybe it's the judgment or maybe it's a guilty plea, we get the dockets in Superior Court at the end of every day for the next day. So we look through them, me and my colleague Betsy Powell in the Stars Courts Bureau, look through the dockets and then kind of see what the charges are and see if perhaps this case has been reported on in the past before it actually entered the system, like when the person was first arrested. So that might mean we're going to go cover that. Um, I also will get lawyers all the time who will like email me a decision from their case or give me a heads up that their case is happening tomorrow and they think I might be interested for X, Y, Z reasons. Um, and then sometimes it also just happens, but because I'm like at the courthouse at 361 and just walking around the hallways and sitting in on courtrooms, and then you never know what you might actually end up
Yeah.
witnessing. So yeah, but it's entirely self-assigning. Like I certainly don't like my editors generally don't reach out and say, we'd really like you to cover this case today, or could you do this one? It's really up to me to look at what's going on each day and to kind of decide for myself what is worth covering.
And do you go to court every day, Jacques?
Not every day, no. And obviously now since the pandemic, a lot is done over Zoom. So
Right.
I sometimes go in person, sometimes I go over Zoom, and then other days I'm not working on anything related to a specific court case at all. It's usually I'm because I'm working on stories from home about more systemic issues or features or things that take longer than a day to produce. Yeah. But when I am covering a trial, I'm usually go most days for it, especially if there's no Zoom option. Yeah.
Right. And well, since you mentioned some systemic issues, let's
Mhm.
talk a bit about that because you have been covering some of the systemic issues in criminal law. Among them are the 11B issues, the judicial vacancies, and the very Toronto specific problem of staffing and the new Toronto courthouse. So let's talk a little bit about these issues, Jacques, because I mean, you know what's been going on. You've been covering this quite a lot in your reporting. So tell us more about these issues.
Yeah, because it's like there's like a real resourcing issue, of course, in the courts,
Mhm.
and it's led to, unfortunately, cases being stayed due to delay. And on the Superior Court side, let's start there.
Yeah,
There's a real judicial vacancy problem. And of course, everyone who's going to listen to this knows who appoints those judges. It's the federal government. And there are, something like almost 24 judicial vacancies in Superior Court across Ontario, and about 6 or 7 of those are in Toronto. And what I've noticed since just so that's been a problem for years, but what I've noticed since just like last December is the judges at 361 seem to now really be fed up with the lack of judges causing cases to accumulate delay. And so we've now had 2 criminal cases stayed due to delay since December. One was a sex assault, and then another one was firearm related, if I remember correctly, firearm possession. And so I've heard through the grapevine that there's potentially more and maybe that have been stayed with written reasons to follow. So it just seems like the judges are now really fed up about this vacancy issue that has festered for years. And they're really kind of doing the only thing that's within their power to do as judges. Like, I mean, I can't think of something that sends a more powerful message to the government to finally fill these vacancies than staying these cases. So that's the
right.
big problem right now on the one of the big problems on the Superior Court side. It's also, of course, I know this is in the context of criminal cases, but it's also, of course, having a pretty detrimental impact on the civil side as well of Superior Court. It takes a very long time to schedule a civil case because because among other reasons, there's a lack of judges. Um, and then on the provincial side, at the OCJ across the street at the new courthouse on Armory Street, things are apparently a little better now. But when that courthouse opened last year, because it amalgamated all the provincial courthouses in Toronto into
Right.
one, right downtown, um, a lot of the staff who were in these older courthouses just didn't like they couldn't go there every day to work because
Yeah.
they're already underpaid, overworked. A lot of them live pretty far within the city or even outside of the city, and they can't afford to commute downtown every day and as well as pay for parking. So a lot of staff members were just not coming into work, and it was causing a real staffing crisis at the new courthouse. And so I wrote about a couple cases again that were stayed due to delay because there was no staff
Hmm.
available. So they couldn't keep the courtrooms open. So it
Yeah.
led to all of these trials constantly getting pushed further and further down the road, and then some of them ultimately getting stayed due to delay. And I think what was notable about all of this as well is that like the provincial government had been warned for years as this amalgamation was being worked on that this problem would happen. That staff just can't that like these are we're talking about like clerks, court reporters mostly. They just can't afford to commute downtown every day on the current salary that they're making, and they're
Yeah.
just not going to go in. And I don't know if the government ignored that or didn't properly plan for that. But then that's the result that we saw last year was these cases getting stayed because of that. And it's only now since September that apparently since September there have been no courtroom closures in the new courthouse because the government said they kicked in an extra $6 million to hire more people and to make more on-call staff permanent because there was a real crisis on their hands. I remember
Yeah.
one judge staying a sexual assault case and a youth case saying these shortages are wreaking havoc in the
Hmm.
building. Like no, nothing was getting done. I remember sitting in courtrooms and crowns would be showing up and saying, "We've got all our witnesses here for an impaired driving trial, ready to go. The interpreter's here, everyone's here." but there's no courtroom for us. And we were also all here yesterday, and there was no courtroom for us. And so that's just no way, there's just no way to run a system, a
But
courthouse.
when you say no courtroom, it's not that they were missing an actual courtroom. There wasn't enough staff for the
Exactly.
courtroom, right? Because I mean,
Exactly. You need that. You need staff
yeah,
to actually open up. You need a clerk who can like
right.
process exhibits and open court and do all those kinds of things. And what we were also seeing at the new courthouse was because there were so few clerks at one point who were even coming in, they
Hmm.
were kind of doubling up judges in the courtrooms that could remain open. So they'd have to squeeze in as many cases as possible into one courtroom, which was inevitably also just causing delay. Like it was very chaotic for a few months
And do you know
there.
what time they were ending court? In
Sometimes
this,
they would be sitting very late,
yeah,
especially at the new bail court, because they also
yeah.
merged all the adult bail courts into the old courthouse up at 2201 Finch. And I remember watching some of those proceedings over Zoom when they first merged the bail courts, and they were routinely sitting till 7 o'clock,
Oh,
sometimes
wow.
later, 8 o'clock. And I remember um, one time I was watching a bail court at the new Toronto Regional Bail Center is what
Hmm.
they call it. Um, there were at least four consent releases that got put over till the next day just because there wasn't enough time to deal with the paperwork. So it's like four people who were like, the Crown was
Weren't
like,
so,
need a
were not
consent.
supposed to be there.
Yeah, and they spent a night in jail because they couldn't reach the paperwork in time because they were so swamped in those courtrooms. So that's really bad, right?
Yeah.
Like um and so there was just yeah, it was a lot of chaos, especially last year. Yeah.
But it seems like things are a little bit better now than.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I still when I go over to I spend more time at 361 than at the new courthouse on Armory.
Mhm.
But when I do go into the Armory courthouse, I'm just always struck by how empty the hallways are.
But is
I
that a
think
post-pandemic thing? Because I
it
think that
might be, yeah.
since the pandemic, I don't think any courthouse has gone back to the pre-pandemic rhythm or
Yeah, so much of it's done over Zoom
yeah.
too. And it's just a bit eerie because it's also got like this still got like this new building smell. It's now been
Yeah.
open for almost a year. It's very clean and pristine. It doesn't look like any of the old courthouses in
Right.
Toronto that they
Right.
shut down. But it's just like, yeah, it's just there's like no one in them. But yeah, I think a lot is being done over Zoom for sure.
Yeah.
361 still looks fairly busy. I mean, a lot of the cases there, people are still mostly, I think there's a lot that still gets done in person there because of jury trials and all of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, I did visit the new courthouse. I can say I don't know the old one, but it's pretty nice for
It
someone
is, yeah.
who's seen it for the first time. I think it's really very nice. It's a huge building.
It's huge, yeah.
So, I mean, there's definitely space, but hopefully
Mhm.
there will be more staff to fill the
Mhm.
space. But I
Absolutely.
wanted to ask you, Jacques, because I mean, you've been reporting about these issues. They're really problematic in criminal law. Um, as someone who's practicing, like I practice in this area, I think I find it a bit outrageous when we have these issues going on. But what is the public reaction to the issues in criminal law? Do you feel like the public cares, or do you feel like people don't really care about what happens to criminals?
I can say like I think generally the public cares when a case gets staged, whether it's for delay
Hmm.
or a case gets, evidence gets excluded because of police committing so many charter breaches. Like there are when cases get staged or there are acquittals based on charter breaches, like I do think that that enrages the public. I think
Right.
it probably is more difficult and always has been for an average member of the public to be sympathetic to the plight of someone who is accused of a crime, even though they are, of course, presumed innocent,
But why
right?
do you think
It's
that's the issue? Like
Mhm.
especially like whether there has been a trial and the person was acquitted, so
No.
definitely that means that the Crown evidence wasn't strong enough,
Mhm.
or whether it's because there have been some charter issues. I mean, maybe I keep seeing this from a defense perspective that
Mhm.
if there are problems on the part of the police and the way they executed whatever the search or whatever it is, that it must be enraging to know that someone is going to have to pay the price with their liberty
Mhm.
for a problem that is made by someone who's supposedly trained not to screw things up. So, but
Absolutely.
why do you think that the public still gets angry at that?
I suppose it doesn't help when you hear politicians kind of exacerbating things,
Mhm.
like especially with rhetoric around bail, and you when you hear certain politicians talking about bail, for example, they talk about it as if the person is already guilty as soon as they've been arrested and should be held in jail basically indefinitely, or at least until their trial. Like I don't think that helps at all. There's been a lot of unfortunate political rhetoric always around the justice system. It's almost an easy um, thing for politicians to pick on, and it preys on people's fears about other people and about accused criminals. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to get the public to understand, like as you were just saying, that like there's been a charter breach. It's affected a person's liberty, but it's like
Yeah,
the charter applies to like it's like members of the public, I think, sometimes forget that the charter applies to everyone. Could apply to anyone who it applies to anyone who ends up being arrested.
yeah,
And um yeah, it is frustrating because I get emails too, of course, sometimes from people who
yeah,
will say, well, who cares? Like, who cares if the cops violated five different sections of the charter because they did find a gun in the guy's car, or they did strip search him illegally, but they found drugs. Like, and it's just
like
it
the
can be
ends justify the means. Yeah,
absolutely. It's a lot of that. And it's difficult to get through to people like that, you know? It's difficult for them to understand that, like, well, if the police had just not violated the charter and it's quite possible this person would have been convicted because, yes, there was a gun in their car, but it's just, it doesn't allow the police to do whatever they want. And it doesn't allow the Crown to, you know, be really slow at disclosing evidence.
yeah, yeah.
No, it's very difficult to get the public to understand these things. Yeah, I try. I do what I can. I try to make
Well,
it as
that's
clear as
what I
possible.
was going to ask. Like, maybe, like, is there, I mean, there are different aspects maybe to this issue or to this public perception of the criminal justice system and the actors in the criminal justice system. But I mean, what part does the media or journalism have to do? Like maybe better education to the public about the role of the defense and the rights of individuals. I mean, because there seems to be some kind of disconnect between how the public perceives criminal defense and like obviously criminal defense lawyers get often criticized
Yeah,
um,
yeah. And like, how
for
can
the,
you represent such a person?
exactly.
Yes, yeah. Um, I think first of all, it's like there might be a bit of a media literacy issue in this country, and I think like unfortunately more and more people aren't necessarily getting their information from mainstream media to begin with.
Hmm.
So there's like a whole group of people there who just don't trust or don't read mainstream media at all. So I'm not really sure how you get to them. And then there is another, and then within mainstream media, though, of course, we're not a monolith, so I can only really speak for myself, but I know in my own work I do try to explain like when a case is stayed due to delay, for example, that it's because the Supreme Court has said this and that it's in line with this section of the charter and that exists to protect a person's trial. Like I always have like a boilerplate paragraph that I put in like
Yeah,
every story about a case being stayed due to delay to explain like why and to explain that like no, it does not mean that the defense can just deliberately drag their feet for 30 months and then get the case stayed, because that's what people think, right?
yeah,
People, when it comes to delay stories, people think, oh, so the defense just doesn't have to do anything for 18 months, then the case will get stayed due to delay. I'm like, no, that's not how it works. And I try to make that clear in stories and with evidence being excluded because of charter breaches and the balancing that judges have to do in doing that. like it doesn't, just because a judge has found that there's a charter breach, it of course doesn't automatically mean that the evidence gets excluded. It gets balanced against other things. Um, but I also think people have like short attention spans. I read the comment
Mm-hmm.
section sometimes on my stories and I'm like, I've explained this though, and you clearly haven't read beyond the first two paragraphs, or you haven't even read beyond the headline. And so that's frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's like I do try to break things down for people as much as I can in the space that I'm given to do it. But looking at the comments sometimes it really hits me that like, oh, this person just saw the headline and popped off and didn't bother to read the story that would have
But
explained
don't you think
it
that
to me.
that's a problem, though, Jacques? Because I mean, the articles that are written in the, well, not just in the Toronto Star, they're lengthy. I mean, whoever writes
Mhm,
them, whether it's you or some of
mhm,
your colleagues, you do take the time to write and to explain.
mhm.
But this attention span thing, maybe because of TikTok or what's going on social media, like people, or Twitter, where you have limited space and you have to express an idea and like a certain amount of num words.
Mhm,
um like, don't you think that that's also becoming a problem, that people just want just a summary and they don't take the
mhm.
time to read and to get more information?
Absolutely. Yeah, and also that a lot of people just want something to confirm a view that they already hold,
Hmm.
unfortunately, and they just kind of disregard anything that counters that view. Like, so I deal with that too a lot. It's just like people already have a view and they're just going to look for media that confirms that view, whether it's like an accurate view based on the circumstances or not. And the short attention span, absolutely. Like I'm always so mindful when I'm writing, and I try to write kind of like shorter and shorter, but also like still trying to get as much context as
Yeah.
possible in a story and to make it fair and accurate, and getting like lawyers to respond if they want to respond. Um, but it also sometimes just feels like you can go shorter and shorter and people are still not reading the whole thing. Like I can't just write a whole story in two paragraphs, right?
Yeah.
But so that's a general frustration among journalists, I think, for sure, the short attention spans. And it leads, of course, to people therefore like not learning something valuable about the justice system when it comes to not like when they don't properly and closely read a story about the system.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's frustrating for sure.
Definitely. And I wanted to ask you as well, Jacques, in your experience, have you felt that there is a decline in the readership? Like, do you think that there are less people who are reading articles from the Star or any other newspapers? I mean, they were traditional newspapers. Now everything
Mhm.
is becoming electronic. But do you feel like there is a decline in the number of readers, or is it the same?
Um, I think there probably has been a general decline overall over the years. It's like a constant struggle for media has been to retain readers and to
Yeah.
attract new readers. A lot of people just don't a lot of people also just don't want to pay for
Hmm.
media anymore. And so they just choose not to engage with it because they don't want to pay for it. So that's been a constant struggle for years. I mean, it's like one of the biggest challenges facing the media industry is just um, keeping people engaged enough to want to read what we're writing. Yeah. I don't know exact statistics, but I do think anecdotally it's fair to say that yes, like readership has unfortunately declined across the board
Yeah.
over the years. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, moving on to I mean, still in the criminal law sphere, but I mean, if there are some interesting cases that you've recently covered that you can maybe tell us about, like this is an opportunity to talk about a case not in writing, which is your usual way of reporting on a case, but if you can just tell us a little bit about one or two interesting cases that you've covered recently.
Definitely recently would be the Peter Nygard sexual assault
Hmm.
trial, which took up most of the fall last year. And it was, a fairly lengthy sexual assault trial because there were five complainants testifying. And then he decided to testify in his own defense over several days. And the jury ended up being out for something like, I think it was just over 4 days. So it was a lot of like waiting around with other journalists in the
Yeah.
hall 361, which is always, kind of fun, but also wondering like, when are we getting out of here?
Yeah.
Um, but that was a very interesting, like that was an interesting case. It was obviously, it was a high profile nature given who Peter Nygaard is, um, multiple complainants, um, and Brian Greenspan being the defense lawyer and very, very well known, of
Yeah.
course, criminal defense lawyer. And the fact too that Mr. Nygaard is facing so many other, like, is facing charges in several other
Yeah.
jurisdictions. This is just one of several cases he's facing in Canada and the United States. So it's the first trial I've done in a while where I actually was there every day for it,
Hmm.
and writing a story every day because there was always something significantly new happening. Like I like in from a journalist perspective, when going to a trial, there are going to be days where it just doesn't make sense to write a new story
Right.
based
And
on what
not
was
much
said in court
happens
that day.
every
Not much
single day.
happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, like if it's a and homicide trials can be like that because homicide trials can be fairly lengthy, and you
Yeah.
hear from a lot of like experts. You hear from a pathologist, you hear from cell phone tower experts, you hear from multiple police witnesses, crime scene mapping, all sorts of stuff like that. And it's very relevant for the case, and the jury needs to hear it, but it's not necessarily newsworthy. It's very
Yeah.
difficult to condense that into a story that your average member of the public is actually going to want to read. But something like the Nygaard trial, it's that almost every day there was a new complainant on the stand testifying. And so it was completely new information about an allegation in some cases that he ended up being convicted on. And then of course his defense. So that was really interesting. And also, I guess I would also just say more generally when covering trials, because I know lawyers are watching, um, it's very helpful just in general, it's very helpful to journalists when lawyers, both defense and crown, but defense tend to be more open to talking than crowns. Um, it's very helpful to journalists to be able to have off the record conversations with lawyers to be like, I think this was said in court, but I'm not, did he say that? Is that what I heard on the stand, or is it something else? Like, I want to get, because we want to get it right. We want to get stories accurate. And like, oh, did you say like your defense is going to be this, or or was it that? Like, I'm not sure. Could you just clarify? And so in my experience, a lot of lawyers, and again, especially defense lawyers, are open to those conversations. And I would just like really encourage that because it's really helpful. And we just want to get the story right. I know I do. Like, I'm not out to make anything more sensational than it might already
Hmm.
be. Because some cases are just sensational by their nature. I don't need to play them up. But like, I just want to get the story accurate. I want to make sure that what I think I heard in court is accurate. I want to like, so that's really helpful to a journalist is to be able to have those off the record conversations with lawyers. And then, sometimes at the end of it, when there's either a conviction or acquittal or a mix, it's great if the lawyers want to provide some form of on the record comment about how the case went, whether they're considering an appeal. And sometimes it can be just things like we're reviewing the case and we're discussing our options and things like that. That's sufficient, you know?
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I would really encourage that for lawyers to be open to doing that with journalists because it's extremely helpful and we really do just want to get the story right. I would also really encourage Crown attorneys to do that, but it's more difficult sometimes to get Crown attorneys to
Yeah.
talk. And that's because the Ministry of the Attorney General has probably told them not to talk, which is very unhelpful.
Yes, but on that point, though, especially when it comes to defense lawyers, I mean, as you said, in the case of crowns, they have some policies sometimes that
Mhm.
prevent them from
Mhm.
talking publicly or making comments.
Mhm.
But defense lawyers, do you think that now I know in your case you're very well liked
Mhm.
by defense lawyers, especially in Toronto, because this is where you mainly are located, and you're fairly known and people like you. But do you think that in some other cases, if there is this kind of reluctance from defense lawyers to talk to the media, do you think that it's because there's a trust issue or this concern that their side or whatever they say may not be represented accurately in the reporting?
Yeah, I could see that. And I guess I would go revisit what I just said and would say, um, lawyers should feel free to talk to me
Yeah.
specifically. Completely selfish for like I'm just being very selfish right now, and everyone should just talk to me. Um, I no, but I can understand where a lawyer is dealing with a journalist who they've never met before, or or they're completely unfamiliar with their work, and so they might feel I could understand a lawyer being worried that this off the record conversation maybe isn't going to be off the record,
Mm,
or what I do say on the record is going to be completely misconstrued. I can see that concern, and it's difficult for me to really respond to that because it's just like every journalist is different. I'd like to think though that most of like pretty much all of my colleagues, especially colleagues who cover the courts on a regular basis, are all really professional and ethical and good at what they do, and um, can be trusted when lawyers are looking to talk to a journalist. But I can't like, fortunately, I can't like speak for every journalist in every case in every kind of court in
right.
Ontario, right? Like it's just I think um, I think at the very least, and it again, it depends. If you're a lawyer and you're aware that your case has garnered media attention, whether you like it or not, right? Like if it's a Peter Nygard or if it's a
Yeah.
Jacob Bogard, that's going to garner media attention. Who I like, you just know it will.
Yeah.
It I think at the very least, it's helpful if at the end of the case, once a decision has been rendered, that yeah, the lawyer makes an on the record comment. It can be very carefully crafted, but at the very least, make that kind of on the record comment about what happens, what might happen next. How is your client feeling? Is there anything else you want to say? Um, at the very least, lawyers, I think, should feel comfortable being able to do that. And it can be brief. It can definitely be brief. And then, yeah, as for the like the off the record chats during a trial to help clarify matters, it is really helpful. And I'd love to be able to say that it's going to be a perfect trusting relationship between lawyer and journalist in every case, but I just don't know every lawyer and every journalist.
Right.
Um, I can say that I'm very, you can trust me. I'm very trustworthy.
Well, I mean, so that's the thing. If we want to encourage more people to talk to you, Jacques, because I mean,
Yeah.
you seem to be
Yeah.
pretty open. Like if
Yeah.
someone contacts you and they say that they have a case,
Mhm.
and you seem to be open, and you're like you don't have some cases that you'll never cover. Like if you'll just cover pretty much everything in criminal law.
Yeah.
But what is your method? Like, how do you work? Like, do you just rewrite what you've been told, or like how, like if maybe if you can explain how you work, that could also help um, lawyers
Yeah.
approach you.
Like it depends it depends if I'm covering a trial and there's a certain witness testifying
Mhm.
today. Um I always usually go in with my laptop and I record it because we're journalists, we are allowed to record in courtrooms, and so I've got that for to double check to make sure my notes are accurate. But I'm like typing away and I'm usually already kind of writing the story as the testimony is ongoing.
Mhm.
The witness might say something like that immediately jumps out at me as like, this is really new information, this is really kind of significant, the story should start with this. I'll kind of start writing it, but the testimony could be still going on for another 3 or 4 hours, and he or she might say something like completely even bigger, or like or also walk back what they said in the morning. So I'm also just like constantly
Readjusting.
readjusting and
Yeah.
rewriting throughout the day. And I'm pretty fast. I'm usually able to file a story within about a half hour of court ending for the day. Um, and then it's the same with if I'm doing a story on like a decision, like if a lawyer, for example, or I'm constantly looking on Candly, and I should say that too,
Yeah.
because lawyers will often say to me, "How did you even hear about this decision?" And I'm like, "Candly is available to the public,
Yeah.
Like, that's how I found out about it." So sometimes a lawyer will send me a decision, but most of the time it's just decisions that I found myself. I'll um I'll usually start by reading from the bottom because I want to know I'll look through all the criminal decisions that get added regularly to Canley, and I immediately go to the bottom because I want to see what like if
Right.
it's like charges are stayed. I'm like, okay, that's interesting right away. So why were they
Mhm.
stayed? Like, so I start going up. It's like, oh, it's a delay. oh, it was a sexual assault. Oh, this was like the second time, this was like the second trial, and the Crown really botched it or something. And it's just like, okay, makes it more and more interesting and worth reporting on, and it highlights a systemic issue, delay in the system. So I always start with the bottom. Court of Appeal, I check, like Court of Appeal decisions, I check every day when they
Hmm.
get released at noon, and I always start from the bottom. If it says appeal dismissed, like I'm immediately sort of less interested,
Yeah.
but I'll still go up and see, okay, because if
But
it's
most appeals are dismissed.
most appeals are dismissed, but when they're allowed, immediately my interest
Of
is
course.
I'm like more drawn to it. But if it's like a high profile individual, I'll probably write on it. If it's a high profile case, I should say, I'll write on it regardless of the outcome. Like there was one just a few weeks ago. It was the Kalen Schlatter
Mhm.
murder appeal, very infamous murder in the gay village. In 2017, and his appeal was quickly dismissed. Actually, the panel didn't even call on the Crown and came back and dismissed it. But I wrote on it because like that was a very high profile case. We
Yeah.
covered the entire trial. I'm going to for sure cover the appeal regardless of the outcome. But yeah, so generally with decisions, I start by reading the bottom and I work my way up. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jacques, for taking the time today to chat with me about your work. And it's very nice to read what you post. You're certainly very popular on the social media
I'm glad
and
to
in the
hear that.
Star. And I hope, well, I'm pretty sure that you'll have more and more defense lawyers who will keep bothering you. And
Yes, please bother me. Send me all your decisions.
oh,
Send
actually,
me
and I
all the
also wanted to
decisions.
ask you, do you, so you only work or cover stories in Toronto, like is this where you're based, or do you
Yeah.
travel sometimes to other jurisdictions?
Definitely primarily
Hmm.
Toronto. I will sometimes write on cases in the GTA or
Yeah,
just outside of the GTA, but usually those cases are decisions. Like I don't I'm not going to drive to Milton to
yeah,
cover a case.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But I do most of my trial coverage and most of my just coverage in general is Toronto related. Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Jacques, for taking the time to chat with me today about what you do. It's very nice to see you and to actually talk to you as opposed to reading what
Yeah.
you write. And well, I'm sure we'll read more from you about what's happening in the courts.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. This was great. Really appreciate it.